I find myself slightly nervous tonight, which is very odd for me. I got up and spoke Sunday night at Carnegie Hall with 3,000 people with not the slightest problem. But this is a new venture for me, the first time I've ever written fiction on purpose. And and part of me feels, mildly guilty because we're in the middle of this year when it's all hands on deck and we need everybody fighting as hard as we can. And we had the buoyant experience Tuesday night of being allowed to at least hope that we might get the country back at some point somewhere down the road and so on. Truthfully, I've been working on this book for years, but the reason that I decided that it might be a good idea to put it out this year was in part because it seemed to me like we were like everybody was kind of beleaguered psychologically and a little overwhelmed by the events of the last year, and that it might be good to write, to publish anyway, a book that was sort of both about the resistance and less depressing than my books usually are. My job in the world is usually simply to bum people out. In this case, much more to cheer them up a little bit. And I've been happy that the reviews and things that have come out have captured that about this book. It's kind of a love letter to the resistance that I've spent the last 10 or 15 years with some of my colleagues like Vanessa working to build, and that has really come of age in the last year in the era of Trump. And so this is an attempt to kind of imagine, try and think a little bit about resistance creatively, what it might look like in some of its different guises. And in particular, it's a story about the state that's home to Sue and myself and a couple of other people in this audience, Vermont. Not a very important state, as it happens, the second smallest state in the Union, the most rural state in the Union, the fewest people living outside of cities, one of the whitest places in all of America. So a place that actually should have been ground zero for the kind of Trump idea. And indeed, on either side of it, in New Hampshire and in upstate New York, that's more or less what happened, followed the pattern of other parts of rural America. But Vermont, for a series of reasons that are a little hard to pin down, has always been a different kind of place. And that, I think, is one of the things that got me thinking a little bit about this book, the plot device of which is a kind of accidental rebellion that gets going where the cast of somewhat unlikely characters end up kind of pushing Vermont in the direction of seceding from the Union. I will tell you in advance that I don't think myself that that's a particularly good idea. In fact, in Vermont, it would be impossible. We're a very old state, and merely the threat of cutting off Social Security would be enough to bring us to heel immediately. On the other hand, I've never understood why California stays in the Union. 40 million people, an economy the size of Germany, and they have the same 2 senators that we get in Vermont. It's crazy. And so I just kind of let my mind wander a little bit. Let me read you from the very beginning, a kind of a description of one of the acts at the beginning of this rebellion. A beer truck lumbered slowly off the Crown Point Bridge and began the drive up Route 22 toward Burlington, and hadn't gone a mile before the driver came to an orange detour sign in the middle of the road and turned left on a dirt farm track. He drove about a mile more, past cows staring impassively at the sides of his truck with its pictures of two young women in bikinis reclining in a hot tub and hoovering Coors Light long necks with an ardor that suggested deep and full-bodied pleasure. Around a bend in the road, the truck driver found another detour sign and followed it for 2 miles till yet another sign guided him down a dirt road next to a creek lined with willows, a creek still flowing in this mild January. After about a mile of that, with the road turning into a rut, he came upon a lady in a balaclava holding a stop sign. The driver braked, and as he did, 2 young men, also in balaclavas, appeared, one on either side of the truck. Each had a tire pressure gauge, and within seconds, air was hissing out of the front tires, and the truck slumped slightly forward. "Apologies," said the lady in the balaclava. "This will take a little while, I'm afraid. If you wanted to walk to the nearest house and call the police, that's fine, but it's about 4 miles. Or you could wait a little while, and then we'll fill your tires again. Anyway, we've made you a picnic." She put a paper sack on the seat beside the driver and started lifting things out. "BLT with bacon from Vermont Smoke and Cure. Here's a whole pint of Stratford Creamery maple walnut ice cream. And here's something special, a bottle of the new Long Trail Coffee Stout from Bridgewater Corners. The coffee doesn't come from Vermont, but it is roasted here. You can only have one stout because we're serious about DUI in this state, but I think you'll find it filling. And we've got a gift pack of beers from 51 of Vermont's brewers to send home with you. Did you know we had more breweries per capita than any place on Earth? I have no idea why they think we need Coors too." While she talked, the driver just gaped at her. The 2 young men were busy hauling down cartons of the Coors. They opened each, quickly twisted the caps, then turned the whole box upside down to drain. When the bottles were empty, they loaded the cartons into the back of the 2 pickups. The driver watched from his rearview mirror, and after a little while he finally spoke. "Hey, lady," he said, "this is going to take forever. I've got 1,200 cartons in the truck. Why don't you just toss them over the side and let me go?" The woman looked up at him from above a draining carton of beer. "Oh, sweetie," she said, "this is Vermont. We recycle." 3 hours later, they were done. The balaclava-clad men pumped up his tires with a 12-volt air compressor and then disappeared into the small forest at the edge of the farm driveway. The woman thanked the driver and then disappeared herself. The driver couldn't think what else to do, so he started his truck and headed back toward the bridge and his home in New York, 4,800 bottles of Coors Lighter, but with an impressive stack of cases of Vermont microbrew. The Holstein stared at him with the same unimpressed gaze. So having started this revolution in the direction of the local and the familiar, these guys quickly find themselves hunted, and they hole up in a farmhouse, and a few more people come to their aid, including a woman who was a former biathlon. Do you guys know biathlon? Skiing and shooting, one of the great sports in the world, setting up what's probably the maybe the only cross-country ski chase scene in American literature, maybe the only one necessary. This rebellion's carried out mostly in the name of smallness. It starts with the fight actually at an attempt to stop a Walmart, and we managed to keep Walmarts out of Vermont for a very long time. There's still only a very few in the state. That's kind of where it begins. But it's about the defense of the place and community, and the hero really is a septuagenarian radio host. He's modeled on a little bit on a guy who runs a radio station in Vermont, an old independent radio station called WDEV that carries the Red Sox and the stock car races, has its own bluegrass band, has a good libertarian on for an hour every morning doing right-wing stuff. The only commercial radio station in America that carries Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! So a remarkable place and a remarkable guy. And this guy who I'm calling Vern, he's just out one day. He's sort of going stir crazy because he can't really leave except maybe to wander a little bit through the woods. And he's out wandering behind the house where he's holed up, which, as it turns out, is the home of another one of these characters, a woman who makes her living running a school for new Vermonters, the kind of rich people who retire to Vermont and don't know how to drive in the mud, don't know how to saw down a tree with a chainsaw, so on and so forth. So she teaches them. At any rate, this is going to be, just because I'm getting a little homesick, this part's just a little kind of reverie about the woods where we live. This guy Vern is wandering around in the woods. And it's also about this particular moment in the year, November. This is actually in January, but in the time when winter has finally started to come anyway. Vern had spent enough time in the world's great landscapes to know this wasn't one of them. There weren't but a few acres of old-growth trees left in Vermont, and even they weren't especially grand, a few giant white pines, but nothing like a redwood. There were no seas of jagged granite peaks, no Class 5 whitewater cataracts. When the Audubon Society made calendars each year, 11 of the 12 pictures came from out west, with alpenglow and buck elk and wildflower meadows. Vermont supplied October, and it was usually a close-up of a maple leaf spinning in an eddy on some tiny stream. Still, he thought as he meandered, he wouldn't trade. Not Vermont for Montana, not big sky for the filtered glimpses of blue and white through the treetops, not hardwood for high granite. For one thing, when that yellow came to Vermont and the red and the orange with it, the colors kept you nearly giddy. These last few years had been drab by comparison with the past. Summers too droughty, or so the weathermen said. In fact, we just came through the worst foliage year ever in Vermont. We'd had a horrible drought, and the leaves hardly turned. They just sort of shriveled up and fell off the trees. It was depressing. And when it was over, leaf season, it was even better. The leaves were down by mid-October, and then you could see the shape of the land again, see the late sun silhouetting the trees along the ridge tops as it set. You could sense the architecture of the hills, every hollow and creek run and knoll visible from the road. When people thought of trees, they thought of leaves. That's how a child would draw them. But the natural inclination of trees at this latitude was bareness. 7 months of the year, they stood there stoic. Leaves were the fever dream exception to the barren rule, and Vern felt calmer once they were down. He hiked on, watching for the open seeps in what should really have been an icy wood. Out west, when you walked, you looked up. The mountains were mostly open. You could see for miles, hundreds of miles. But Vermont was closed in now that the sheep were gone, more than 4/5 forest. You couldn't normally see 100 feet in any direction, and so you tended to look down. And the glories were therefore minor key. The splay of turkey tail fungus on a down stump, the root of a birch arched high across a rock, a healthy pile of moose droppings, just smaller than a ping pong ball. Vern contemplated that last for a moment. You didn't see moose very often. You didn't see much wildlife because the woods were dense and it was easy for anything shy to disappear. He'd seen more deer in an afternoon at his sister's house in suburban Connecticut than in a season of sitting on the deer stand, sitting in his deer stand, rifle on his knees. He remembered a trip to Yellowstone when the kids were young, and how odd it had seemed to be able to stand on a ridge and see bears and elk and bison wandering by below in full view. He felt embarrassed for them. It seemed much more natural just to come across traces of scat, buck rub on the soft bark of a cedar, the claw marks of a bear after beech nuts. He didn't need to see the animal itself any more than he needed to see his neighbors in their houses when he drove down the road. The thin line of smoke coming up from the chimney was assurance enough. But knowing that the moose had returned to Vermont in his lifetime pleased him enormously. It was the idea that things repaired themselves, that if you backed off a little and didn't ask too much of the world, then it would meet you halfway. This was one of the last few corners of the planet that had gotten better in the last century, he thought. Greener, healthier. The damage that too many sheep had done was wearing off. Or maybe you didn't even need to think of it as damage. It had been good then when Vermont was full of farmers, and it was good now when Vermont was full of trees. Life ebbed and flowed, came and went. Goodness didn't demand the one-way arrow toward progress and more. It was, he thought, a blessing to have lived out his life in a place that spun slowly like that yellow leaf, an eddy in the American Rapids, a place that was shrinking when most of the country was growing, ever growing, a place where moss covered the back of a giant boulder, what the geologists delightfully call erratics, dropped in place when the last glaciers melted away. A place where the beech leaves still clung brown to the branches, shaking a little in the too warm January breeze. That too warm breeze pulled Vern out of his contentment. He saw a sloppy pile of bear scat on the ground next to his foot, and he shook his head. Bears were not supposed to be out in the woods in January, not in Vermont. They should be in their dens. Vermont might be a place outside the world's rush, but the world's rush was doing it in. Winter was vanishing, a fact that he connected to that Walmart and to the larger globe it in turn was linked to. You couldn't just ignore the world, that was the problem, because now it pressed in on you without regard for borders. Most presidents in his lifetime you could forget for weeks at a time, but not this one with the endless twittering. Too much somewhere else became too much here. Which was why he was a fugitive, he supposed, why he was hiding 50 feet back from the edge of the woods, unseen, but able to watch Sylvia's class hard at work in the driveway. They were learning to run a fire truck, an older pumper like the one most volunteer companies could afford in the small towns. This one was a beauty. Sylvia used it in parades with a sign for her school for new Vermonters bolted to the side. But like all fire equipment, it was basically a pump on wheels, and pumps are always trouble, as Vern knew from many years of Saturday morning fire company meetings dominated by topics like the gasket dried out and it won't hold a prime. At the moment, a former investment banker and a retired radiologist were standing on the bridge behind the truck's cab, pointing at a dial and arguing. Vern couldn't hear them, but he knew what they were discussing. Had the pressure risen high enough to open the nozzle. Sylvia jumped up next to them, yelled something, and they flipped the valve for the deck gun, which immediately started spraying a long and stately arc into the woods. It was as if she knew just where he was standing. Suddenly there was a rainstorm erupting all around him. Moving quickly, he crossed to a small grove of hemlock, which caught most of the falling water in its needles. So these guys mount their resistance and their series of adventures. They managed to stay nonviolent and creative, and they're leading up to the grand moment which is going to come on town meeting day in Vermont, when cities and towns will decide whether they're going to join this secession or not. Town meeting is how Vermont governs itself. Each town meets all the citizens together, one on the first Tuesday in each March. And everybody gets together all day at the high school gymnasium or the church basement or someplace, and they vote on the town budget and decide whether it's time to buy a new grader for the road and whether or not the school roof has another year in it, and so on and so forth. And there's a good deal of debate, and it works surprisingly well. One of the things that it does is demand that people get fairly good at neighborliness. It's one of the things that produces a slightly different strain of politics. You'll recall that when our junior senator ran for president last, his slogan, as his campaign caught on Mr. Sanders across the country, his quite wonderful slogan, my favorite political slogan of my lifetime, was "Not me, us," which was, to me, summed up all that was right about what he was doing. And the hero here is at the several days before the town meeting, still from hiding, manages to get back on the radio in a kind of clandestine fashion for just a few minutes. He figures he has a few minutes before the police will be able to track him down by figuring out where he is, and he wants to use it, doing what he's always done all his life, talking to his neighbors over the radio. And so people are calling in from around Vermont to ask him the kind of somewhat random questions that people tend to ask when they call in radio shows about secession. First caller is the guy who's helping him. The first caller is Sue from Alberg. Hi, Vern. My question is, when you have a country of Vermont, are you going to let there be greyhound racing? Are you going to let there be greyhound racing like they have in Massachusetts? Because I think it's cruel, and I wouldn't want to see it there. We spend a lot of time thinking that everybody's obsessed with the big ideological questions of politics, but in fact, most people happily aren't. They often have other things that are obsessing them. And Vern says, thank you, Sue. I tend to agree with you about the puppy track. There's something about chasing that mechanical rabbit that's just depressing. But here's the point I need to make right at the beginning. I have none, not the slightest interest in running Vermont. I'm not suited for running anything more powerful than a radio switchboard. If a free Vermont came with me attached, I'd vote against it at town meeting and advise everyone else to do the same. And don't think that supporting it means you'll necessarily get a better class of politicians. The only advantage, as I see it, is that at least you'll have the chance to make decisions about things that matter, greyhound racing, but also about whether or not to give health care to everyone, and if we should subsidize big farms or little ones, and if we want to send our daughters and sons off to fight some faraway place. Right now, those decisions are made at such a distance that it's almost impossible to really influence them. A few years ago, the Supreme Court said that corporations were persons. They could spend any amount of money they wanted on elections. If the spirit of Jefferson was still alive, that was the day they put him in the ICU. Vermont by itself wouldn't be perfect, but it would be smaller, so we could actually see what was going on. This is Marcia from Clarendon, and I don't trust politicians. I voted for Obama, then nothing changed, and I've never been to town meeting because it's not for people like me, so I just mostly concentrate on my family. Marcia, just do me one favor. Go to town meeting on Tuesday. I think Clarendon meets in the town hall next to the church. You don't have to say anything. Just sit there and listen. We all need to be reminded that democracy isn't just voting for president every 4 years, then trusting him to fix things. Democracy is about getting together with your community to think about your future. Sometimes it's dull, and sometimes people get long-winded, and sometimes they get stiff-necked, but town meeting's been going on for 300 years, ever since people got to Vermont. Just go see. Vern felt a tap on his shoulder and opened his eyes. Perry, one of his colleagues, was signaling him to wrap up. The feds were closing in. Mark, just time for one more caller here. Even that may be pressing our luck. This is Art from Essex Junction. I just want to say, I think this whole thing is so stupid. The U.S. is the greatest country on earth. If we were off by ourselves, we'd be crushed. Vermont would be Haiti with Holsteins. That's it, just stupid. Ed, thanks for the call. And it's the right note to end on, because I think you're wrong. I think we'd be more like Finland with fall colors. I think we've got plenty of brains and resources to do just fine on our own, but you may be right. And that's the point. I've sat behind a microphone and listened for decades as Americans learned to stop talking with each other and start shouting instead. No discussions, just socialist or fascist or feminazi or bigot or whatever. So here's what I want to say, and I think it's the one thing no one ever says anymore in our public life. I think you're wrong, but you may be right. The kind of meanness of the last year, in a way, has been the most depressing part of the whole deal, the thing that feels most unfamiliar and kind of newest in our civilization to me. And so I think it's really imperative that we figure out how to resist in ways that are as congenial and good-humored as it's possible to be. Firmly, I believe in the kind of things I do, and I, have now a long arrest record to prove it, and so on and so forth. But never never out of the kind of or hope not too often out of the kind of self-righteous zeal that exhibited every time our president tweets his thoughts out to the world. That's the kind of thing that's extremely difficult to get away with in a smaller place. We live in a town, Sue and I, of 400 people. If Donald Trump came to town meeting and stood up and started in with his, bullying about stuff, everyone would just shake their heads. And, if he persisted, after a while, someone would just tell him, no, we don't, that's actually not how we do it here. You should sit down and be quiet now for a while, and it's someone else's turn to talk. Somehow in a country of 300 million, it's gotten easier for that kind of, and in a country where if we address each other at all, it's electronically and not in the flesh, it's gotten easier for that kind of stuff to persist. My publishers, who I'm very happy to have here tonight and very grateful for their good work, they called this a fable when they published it, and I think that's in part to, excuse the fact that as a beginning novelist, perhaps the level of character development or something isn't quite up to what, but really, the good thing about fables is you're allowed to have a moral at the end. And I'm a moralist, if nothing else, so that was a great pleasure to sort of get to the end and then get to clear my throat. I'll read you just the beginning of the author's note at the end. An advantage to writing a fable is that you get to append a moral. In this case, it's not, we should all secede. Instead, it's that when confronted by small men doing big and stupid things, we need to resist with all the creativity and wit we can muster, and if we can do so without losing the civility that makes life enjoyable, then so much the better. I'll finish, we can ask questions, I'll finish just by asking a favor of you all when you go home tonight. When we were in Carnegie Hall last week, and in between sort of introducing Patti Smith and Joan Baez and things, I made everybody there. We passed out papers and pens. We're not going to do that tonight because someone else's house, but we had everybody draft a little letter to the comptroller of the city of New York because we're trying desperately to get him to divest the hundreds of billions of dollars that this city has in its pension funds from fossil fuels. That's been a really important fight the last few years. And around the world now, $6 trillion worth of pension funds and endowments and things have divested from fossil fuel. But it's very much time that New York do the same thing. The city's in the middle of planning to build a large U-shaped seawall that goes just north of here, I think, to try and protect lower Manhattan from the rising ocean. That's going to cost many, many billions of dollars. It's insane that we're investing the city's money in the companies that are making it necessary for us to do this. So the name of the comptroller of the city of New York is Scott Stringer, okay? And he resides, at least professionally, at City Hall. And when you went home, there's probably a way to do this on Facebook or Twitter or something, but since, I live in the woods where I think it's much more effective to actually write letters. So we collected from Carnegie Hall last week 2,400, I think, letters that are now being mailed in day by day to this guy's office. If you guys add a couple of dozen more to that total, it would be useful. You don't have to say much, just it's time for the city to get on board with the fight against climate change. That would be extremely useful, and it would be a gesture sort of the kind that the people in this book are constantly engaged in one way or another. The one thing that I can't do for you that you noticed in the beginning of this book that there was discussion of beer. And in fact, there's a discussion of beer, I'm afraid, as I was reading through the other day, looking for passages to read, there's a discussion of beer on virtually every page of the book, because Vermont really is, that's our biggest industry now. After skiing, beer tourism has become our single biggest industry, and we have the breweries that get voted. So if we were in Vermont and we were doing this letter writing campaign, we'd have open cans of delicious Vermont beer. But if you do this, then you're allowed to treat yourself to something like that on the way home. Ben & Jerry's is the other option if you want it. Thank you all very much for coming and listening. And if you have a question about the book or about where we stand with climate change and things as we head into, we're in the middle of most of Vanessa and I's colleagues are over in Germany right now at the new big UN hearing meeting on climate change. Feel free to ask about any of that various stuff. Or not.
How much undoing is he doing?
How much undoing is Trump doing? Trump's doing, the place where he's getting the most done is on the environment, unfortunately. And it's because a lot of it's not really Trump. Most of what's happening at the EPA and the Department of the Interior would have happened with any Republican. It's the Koch brothers, really. This is their wish list, the list of things they've been working on for many years, and they suddenly got a free hand to do what they wanted. The kind of extra little fillip that Trump has added to the whole thing has been the completely insane decision to actually formally pull out of the Paris Climate Accords, which he did not need to do. I mean, he could just be doing what they're doing, which is just not doing any of the things we promised to do. But in his endless effort to, flaunt his belligerence to everyone, he pulled us out. Yesterday, or the day before, Syria, most dysfunctional government, I mean, it's not even like really a country there at the moment, but they managed to get it together in their complete dysfunction to join the Paris Climate Treaty, leaving the United States as the only nation in the world not a party to this thing. Particularly crazy because the United States contributed far more of the carbon accumulating in the atmosphere than any other country on Earth over the course of the last 150 years. So the decision to pull us out of Paris was it's got to rank among the most shameful foreign policy most of the things that America's done in its foreign policy that have been really shameful, or a lot of them we've done in secret over the years. But this one we did from the Rose Garden proudly, reneged on our commitment to the rest of the planet. Pretty incredible when one thinks about it. The one piece of good news is that the rest of the world seems, instead of to be following his lead, at least some parts of it seem to be making some efforts to step up a little more. The Chinese have clearly decided that this is going to be their path to a kind of moral leadership. More importantly, a path to economic leadership. They have very clear plans over the next 10 years to dominate the production of electric cars, solar panels, which they already dominate, and storage batteries. And those are probably the three most crucial technologies in the world right now going forward. China is going to own them, while we're hard at work making sure that we fully develop the 18th century technology of digging up coal and burning it, okay? Which is, just on every count, just strange.
I'm from Australia, and our government has just allowed the largest coal mine in the Southern Hemisphere to start breaking ground, and we are signed the Paris Agreement, so obviously this would totally renege any commitment to that. I'm just really interested to hear how you maintain hope.
Well, so that's a good question. The question was about what's going on in Australia. and how one stays hopeful. And what's going on in Australia is the government of Malcolm Turnbull is busily coming to the aid of this ludicrous plan to build the largest coal mine on the planet in the Galilee Basin. It's an Indian company called Adani that wants to build this mine. They can't find backing for it in the financial community. Wonderful campaigners, including our colleagues at 350 Australia, have managed to convince the 4 big Australian banks not to provide financing for it. And so the government has announced that it's considering some enormous sum of money for the, just for the, and all you get for these billions of dollars is the first beginning of the railroad that's supposed to someday connect to this valley so that they can start plundering it for coal. There is no chance that that's all going to get built out by the time they've finished the railroad. I mean, the world's demand for coal is going one direction only, but it's a perfect example of how the fossil fuel industry has captured government after government after government, even ones that look sort of much sweeter on the surface. So to our north in Canada, Justin Trudeau is saying every right thing about climate change, he talks about it much more engagingly than I do because he's, as handsome and sexy a world leader as we've ever produced. The problem is he's utterly unwilling to leave in the ground the enormous pile of oil that lies underneath the tar sands in Alberta. He went to the oil and gas conference in Houston 2 months ago and said, no leader would ever find, no country would ever find 173 billion barrels of oil and simply leave it in the ground. Okay, that's how much there is up there. Well, if we don't leave most of the oil and gas and coal we know about in the ground, then there's no use talking about climate change. I mean, it's entirely a mathematical game, and the math is all about how much of it we're going to leave underground. So the way to stay hopeful is to fight like hell. And everybody is. Our great friends in Australia are all, in and out of jail now all the time. Up, in Queensland, they're fighting, and in the cities. We just finished this big tour, Stop Adani tour across Australia. I don't think actually it's all ever going to get built at all. I think it's such a ludicrous thing that it's going to fall somehow of its own weight. But these are the mere fight is super important. We've been fighting the Keystone Pipeline for 7 years now. There's a chance it'll get built sometime in the next year. We don't know. We'll fight it to the end, but Trump may be able to force it through. But even if he does, it's been an entirely successful fight in a lot of ways because it convinced everybody that they could stand up to every other fossil fuel development in the planet, and now nothing gets built for free. There are people like the people in this book who are thinking of creative ways at every turn to stop. I was just tweeting out stuff from our colleagues in Nebraska and South Dakota who, among other things, have been busy building solar panels along the proposed route of the Keystone Pipeline. If TransCanada decides to build it, they're going to have to tear up a huge number of solar panels in order to get it done, and at the very least will make people see that. We win an astonishing number. It blows my mind how often we win. When you fight, you seem to win a fair amount of the time if you can get people out. It's obviously hard right now to win anything in Washington. There's no way to persuade Trump of anything, but city after city and state after state now joining in this fight in interesting ways. When Trump announced that he was pulling out of Paris in the Rose Garden, he said, I was elected to govern Pittsburgh, not Paris, was his alliterative reasoning for why he had done this. 2 hours later, the mayor of Pittsburgh said, we're going 100% renewable energy in Pittsburgh, thank you very much, which was the right response. The problem with climate change is, and the reason that one can get very despairing is, it's the one of these problems that comes with a real time limit. And what Trump is costing us is time. Time that we should be trying to accelerate the rate at which we're dealing with things instead of slowing it down. So I don't know how it's all going to come out, but we stay. There are days when I get a little despairing, and that, frankly, is one of the reasons that I am, over the last number of years, have been occasionally secreting myself away to work on this book, because better sometimes to laugh than to cry if you're, if those are the choices.
I'm from Norway, and so Norway is a country full of fossil fuels, and we have a pension fund which is like
Yes.
billions of dollars. And just wondering if you had any advice as to how, for instance, what could they invest or?
So Norway is a very good example.
Yeah.
Norway has.
We have water,
You have the biggest sovereign wealth fund in the world. Norway, unlike, Americans or Saudis or someone, Norway took all the money in good Norwegian fashion. Instead of wasting it on something, they put it away, in a big pot of money that just keeps growing bigger and bigger. So literally the largest pot of money in the world is the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. And it's now divesting from certain parts of the fossil fuel industry, from tar sands, from coal. The fight now in Norway, as you know, is over whether Norway is going to decide to go drill in the Arctic or not. And it's a epically important fight. The state oil company, Statoil, wants to go do it because drilling for oil is what they know how to do, But it looks like a majority of Norwegians don't really want them to, and it's become a highly contentious political issue. Sue and I were in Tromsø last winter, and as we flew into Tromsø, we could see the big drilling rig, the big Statoil rig, waiting to go up into the Arctic. When that was going on the west coast of the United States 2 years ago, it was one of the great victories. It was really one of the things that kept me thinking as I was writing this book, one of my favorite moments in this whole crusade we've been working on. Shell Oil wanted to go drill in the Arctic, in the American Arctic, which, if you think about it, is completely insane. I mean, scientists had explained to everyone, if you burn all this coal, gas, and oil, the Arctic will melt. Then the Arctic melted, just as they said. And instead of Shell or Statoil or somebody looking at that and saying, maybe this is not working out, maybe we should do solar panels instead, they were like, whoa, now the Arctic's melted, it'll be easier to drill for more oil, let's go. It's the kind of thing that makes you question whether the big brain was a really successful adaptation or not, But there were lots of people with good brains and very big hearts attached to them who, in the harbors in Portland and Seattle, rallied to block these enormous drill rigs from getting to the Arctic. And these things they look like something out of Star Wars. They're 40 stories tall, these huge rigs. People out in small craft surrounding them, blocking them. We called them kayaktivists. And they kept them in the harbor for days and did so much brand damage to Shell that by the end of the summer, Shell was like, forget it, we're out of it. We've spent $7 billion on this, but we're not spending any more because we can't sustain this kind of brand damage indefinitely. We're not going to drill in the Arctic. Trump wants to revive it. I don't think he can. We'll see. But the reason that really struck me was just I wish I had the picture of it to show you, of all these kayaks out in front of this drill rig. This is a battle between very large and very few against the very many and very small. And the job of building movements, the job of resistance, is figuring out how to make that many and small enough to block the big and the few doing their thing. And some of that's just sheer numbers. It's turning lots of people out. But some of it's creativity and wit and art and passion and all the other things that... So probably some of you were at the Women's March, say, in Washington earlier this year. It was great to see huge numbers of people. It was equally great to see the incredible wit on the signs that everybody was there. Sue and I stopped on the way in the evening at one of those parks in Washington, and there were thousands, people had left thousands upon thousands of signs, and each one was funnier and more biting than the one before. That's part of this resistance we're building too. You may recognize the voice. If you close your eyes, you may recognize the voice of Amy Goodman coming from the back there.
Is it true that in Bonn that there's two delegations? There's the Trump delegation, and they're pushing nuclear and coal. So they're still going, even though they're pulling out. And then there's this big mayor's delegation, everything that are pushing the alternative.
Oh, yeah.
District. And then what do you think, what is the role of activists now? What does it mean the U.S. is pulling out? It can't pull out right away. So.
Well, the U.S., what the U.S. is trying to do, the Trump administration, is slow down. You know, it's not just that we're not content with merely not participating. We're doing our best to sabotage the entire thing. And so the Trump administration is sending over, I think, Rick Perry, but some delegation to, they're giving a big presentation to the rest of the world next week on why coal is good for poor people and why we should have more coal to aid the poor around the world. And they're doing it, it must be said, on a week when the city of New Delhi has closed 4,000 schools because the air has gotten so impossible to breathe. I mean, the monitors we have for measuring particulates in the atmosphere measure particulates up to 999 parts per million, which is 30 times what the safe levels are. Well, a couple of days ago, the monitors all hit 999 parts per million, and then it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. I mean, you cannot breathe there. We would not be having this meeting there tonight or anything else, you know. So that's what the official delegation is doing. And then there's this whole other phenomenon that you describe of what we now, since everything at the UN has lots of odd jargon names, we now describe as subnational actors, which means mayors and governors and regional leaders, and they're from all over the world. They're in Bonn right now, but they're all coming to California next September. Jerry Brown has called a summit of subnational actors to try and sort of make Paris, make that agreement, keep it in force somehow or another. The irony of all of this is the Paris Agreement itself is extraordinarily weak and isn't anywhere near enough to do what we need to do around climate change anyway. The hope was that it was going to lead to a kind of acceleration of action, that it would be a floor, not a ceiling for action. But the Trump administration, I think, under the guidance of the fossil fuel industry, has decided that they can put such a crimp in it that that'll be the end. We'll see.
In one of the passages you read, I think it was maybe the second one, you talked about the arrow that was pointing to more and pointing to progress. And I'm curious, I feel this tension between sort of like either you got to move to Costa Rica and totally disconnect from this whole thing, or it's hard not to be guilty in just your daily actions. You're going to go to and obviously it's not that extreme in reality, so I'm curious if you can talk to the middle ground, or if there's something you look to, or you said seceding is not the vision you would put forth, so. Not
yet. Give us, if Donald Trump wins again, all bets are off, you know. But yeah, look, so the question about like feeling guilty is the wrong, it always strikes me as the wrong way to look at this. It's how environmentalists looked at things for quite a while. That the real answer was you have to change your life in some way, change your light bulbs, whatever. All of which is important, as you guys know better than most. I mean, our house is covered with solar panels. I drove the first electric Ford in Vermont, I think, so on and so forth. But I don't think for a minute that has anything to do with stopping climate change. You can't make the math work anymore one person at a time. And so by far the most important thing for individuals to do is not obsess about their own carbon footprint. It's for them to become slightly less individual and join together in the movements of a scale enough that may have some leverage over policy. That's why we started things like 350.org. So, you know, everybody has a limited amount of time and energy and whatever inside themselves to do what needs to be done. Spend the first quanta of it organizing with your neighbors, out doing the stuff that has, if you have some energy left over, then by all means change your light bulb too. But changing your senator, changing your, price of carbon, changing all those kind of things comes first. And if you're engaged in that, then there's less, you spend less time upside your own navel, worrying about it all, in my experience. Well, I think that that's a good spot to end. Thank you all enormously.